Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com. And yes, today we're taking the plunge. We're going to talk about Beethoven cycles, complete Beethoven cycles. Now, I know this was sort of like our talk about the Beethoven piano sonatas. It's an impossible job. There are so many of them. And so many of them, frankly, have excellent performances. And so we have to have some ground rules, because once I'm done with this talk, I really hope that we can talk about the performances I mentioned rather than the ones I don't, because I know they exist and they're out there and some of you may like them, and that's great. It's perfectly fine. But these are sort of the rules of the game that I've set. First, the most important is consistency. In other words, there should be no dud performances within the cycle. None. Nothing that people could generally say is bad or not up to snuff. You know what I mean? You know what I mean. Second of all, the orchestra is just as important as the conductor. That is, these are cycles that may preserve a certain style of playing, a certain way of presenting Beethoven that either no longer exists or that is wholly unique and quite special of its type, and so it deserves to be heard and recognized for the special qualities that it has. And I think that's a very important thing. You know, we have much too much of a cult of personality today, especially with regard to conductors. I mean, nowadays, conductors have their own independent PR organizations which run around trying to create a mystique about, you know, how great they are. Well, that doesn't interest me, and I don't think it interests you either. I think we want to hear a perfect melding of conductor and ensemble, with each being equally important in realizing Beethoven's vision. I mean, isn't that fair? I really think that makes a lot of sense, don't you? And so those are sort of the ground rules. And the third one, I will say, there's one other that I also had in mind, which is, despite the fact that there may be a complete cycle and it may be consistent and it may be very good, it cannot have great Beethoven performances outside the cycle. Normally, I mean, that is, the best Beethoven performances by that conductor or that ensemble should not be ones that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into the box. That raises a couple of very interesting issues, doesn't it? That's why, for example, Furtwängler ain't going to make it. Because, well, first of all, he wouldn't have made it anyway, because he was never interested in the first two symphonies, especially, right? And he didn't have, he was really a sort of a 5, 7, and 9 kind of guy. I mean, and the Eroica, let's say. And what's in the box, again, there are other performances by Furtwängler that we all know were astonishingly great and which aren't in the box. So he's not there. And that might cause Furtwänglerians to have, you know, a cerebral hemorrhage. But what I'm saying, guys, is stop hemorrhaging, because I'm not saying Furtwängler wasn't great and his Beethoven wasn't great. It was. There's no question about that. It's simply that we're talking about complete cycles. And the reason to talk about complete cycles, in my view, is so that people have something convenient to get started and triangulate where they are with the symphonies and get to know them and be comfortable with them. And from there, you go find your individual performances and things. So that's one guy who's not there. The other guy who's not there is Toscanini. So, you know, I'm an equal opportunity exclusionary person here. Why? Because Toscanini did some incomparable Beethoven, but his greatest seventh is the New York Philharmonic one from 1930, whatever it was. And his greatest third, the Eroica, was the one from like 51 or 53, or I don't remember the date, but it was after the cycle came out. It was released separately. So I'm not including him because there's no reason why you should have second best, even with a genius like Toscanini. I want to make sure that the best performances are in the box. Got it? Okay. So now we're dealing with, I've selected we have 9 symphonies, right? So here are 9 Beethoven cycles. One for each symphony. Isn't that lovely? I mean, I just worked out that way, but I figured what the hell. You know, numerology is entertaining. So let's start at the beginning. The monocycle of choice. Karl Schuricht. I'm sure this comes as no surprise, with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. Now, first of all, Schuricht was an absolutely, let me put this here, absolutely terrific conductor of the type who does not display himself overtly in his interpretations. He simply lets the music speak and he helps it. He does what he can, but he sort of stays behind the scenes. His Beethoven is wholly positive and compelling. There's nothing about it that sounds underplayed or like he's just some sort of Kapellmeister beating time. No. It's all alive and lovely. But the point is, just as important and perhaps even more important, quite frankly, is the fact that he has the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, which was founded in 1828 or so to play Beethoven, and has the largest unbroken tradition of Beethoven performance in our time since Beethoven's death, and thank God they survived long enough to make only one Beethoven cycle. I mean, the great anomaly with the Paris Conservatory Orchestra is that given their Beethoven tradition, you would think they would have played a lot of Beethoven on disc. They did play a lot of Beethoven, but not on disc. They didn't make recordings. Why? Because by the time we got to the fact that recording technology existed, they had been surpassed in the claim to Beethoven authentic performance tradition by German ensembles, and record labels did not want to take the risk of recording Beethoven with a French ensemble. It's that simple and that stupid, because nobody was actually going to listen for the results. Happily, Schuricht came in and did the Beethoven cycle. It's in mono because EMI was withholding its stereo equipment from France so that they could promote all of their English artists. Yeah, I know. And did not give them stereo equipment until the 9th, which was only issued on stereo, not in the box here, but it's on Testament if you want to hear the 9th in stereo. But it's this 9th. So Schuricht is a Beethoven performer of enormous consistency, intelligence, sensitivity, and he has an orchestra who simply has to be heard playing Beethoven. You don't know the performance tradition of Beethoven unless you've heard the way it's done by the Paris Conservatory Orchestra with that fabulous sonority that I've spoken of so many times, where nothing blends with anything else, and all the lines are clear because they're naturally clear. They don't take effort by the conductor, and you don't have to find the hidden inner voice. Everything just tells. It's a wonderful sonority for Beethoven. You may want certain things in the sonics, firmer timpani or more period instrument-y somethings, or I don't know. But it's a great Beethoven cycle. Next, another great Beethoven cycle of similar type. And this may come as a surprise, but I love it. Again, as much for the orchestra as for the conductor. Paul Kletzki with the Czech Philharmonic. Again, we have a tradition of Beethoven performance here that no longer exists. The Czech Philharmonic does not sound like this anymore. I remember I had a conversation once with one of the Czech Philharmonic conductors about, why it had that splendid woodwind sound and, that unique character that no other orchestra could match, et cetera, et cetera. And you know what he told me? He said because they couldn't afford reeds. I said, they start to sound like modern orchestras now. Why is it? He said, well, because since the fall of communism, they can now afford decent equipment. So maybe there was something to that. I don't know. I'm not going to say. But and I'm not going to mention the name of the conductor either. But I get the point. This was a local tradition of performance, and you may not like all the performances equally. I mean, there have been, some people who find these performances to be a little soft-edged, the rhythms to be a little bit mushy sometimes. I get all that. But there are things in these performances that you will hear nowhere else, and they are absolutely consistent, soup to nuts. If you like the sound, you're going to like all of these performances. There aren't any bad ones or any that aren't up to the standard, and it's a very high one, that the Czech Philharmonic and Paul Kletzki set for themselves. I love this cycle. I pull it out, especially for some of the lesser known symphonies like the fourth and the eighth. The eighth is amazing. If you think the eighth is like a sort of stepchild of the Beethoven symphonies, listen to this one. You're not going to believe how much color and detail they get out of it just by being who they are, as it is with Schuricht and the Paris Conservatory. And that's a wonderful thing to hear. It really is. So now we're going to start getting to some of the more sort of perhaps anticipated cycles. And, I'm sorry if this is not coming as a shock. Well, maybe this one will come as a shock, knowing my own personal predilections. Karajan. Now, I don't really like Karajan's Beethoven, personally. I don't. But I have to acknowledge the critical consensus, and I have to acknowledge the fact that these things have had the crap marketed out of them since the day that they were released. And the only thing that stopped them from probably overwhelming the market was the fact that Karajan kept making them, so nobody knew which one to push. This is 1977. However, I'm a little bit iconoclastic in that way. The one that always gets pushed, the cycle that always gets pushed, is 1963, because that's the one where Karajan and Berlin were supposed to have sort of fully gotten their act together, and he was able to impose his initial impression. But remember, he'd already done a Beethoven cycle with the Philharmonia in mono on EMI, and it wasn't as if 63 was so new. People thought it was a revelation in terms of the playing and the whatever. But again, my goal here is to find a cycle that is consistent throughout and that represents the orchestra and the conductor doing what they did uniquely in Beethoven. And that's 77. By 1977, the Berlin Philharmonic was wholly Karajan's machine. It had his concept of sonority, and it was playing exactly the way he wanted it to. And I think in most cases, the performances in this box are better than 63, and certainly better than his later digital cycle. So if you want to get a Karajan Beethoven cycle, and I do like hearing some of these things. I like hearing his ninth. He always did a great ninth. I even like him in some of the earlier ones because, they're fleet and very exciting. What I don't like is the fact that he always sort of buries the woodwind textures. He's a chord guy. He's not a line guy. In other words, he likes vertical sonority and values sonority over all other qualities. I mean, the horns in the seventh don't erupt the way they're supposed to. I mean, things like that just drive me nuts, because he wants this compacted, rich overall sound, and he does that at the expense of Beethoven, who was a line composer, not a chord guy. He was a, contrapuntal, want to hear the bass lines, want to hear, different competing sounds and textures in his orchestra. And in these performances, you don't so much. That's just the way they are. But that doesn't bother other people the way it bothers me. And I have to acknowledge the consistency and excellence of what Karajan and Berlin achieved in this cycle. And so I do. And I hope that you will understand. Of course, if you love Karajan, there's nothing to understand. I've just been crazy not to acknowledge the obvious. So there it is. Next, you know who's coming, or one of the guys who's coming. Charles Mackerras. You got to have Charles Mackerras. Here is period instrument style with none of the period instrument problems. And because he's using a normal, full-size, modern orchestra on which he imposes some of the more lively and effective things that the historically informed performance movement has learned. And on top of it all, he, of course, has his own supreme musicality and excitement and vitality and willingness to intervene when necessary. This is another recording that has no bad performances in it, and it's very, very well recorded. It's exciting as hell. And, Mackerras has his wonderful little, musicological discoveries, like his very, very logical argument. I always thought this was so sensible that the contrabassoon in Beethoven's Fifth did not just enter in the finale where you never hear it unless Theodor Karensis is conducting and makes it a solo. He assumed that the contrabassoon would play along with the bass line all the way through most of the symphony. And, Beethoven only notated it in the finale to make sure that it was there and that it had its own independent line. But it's mostly playing with the basses. So he uses the contrabassoon. You don't hear it. It doesn't matter. But it's one of those smart sort of subtleties that you can always count on Mackerras to have thought through. And there are no sort of performance issues in these versions that haven't been solved or at least thought about. So, Mackerras with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. Now, he also has a cycle on Hyperion with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and in the 9th with the Philharmonia. I think it's the Philharmonia. And it's also excellent. It's live. It has some audience noises. The playing is maybe a little less polished, I think, sometimes than these. But this is the cycle I like. And Mackerras is a genius. And his Beethoven is invariably consistently fine and supremely musical. Next, we're going sort of the opposite end of the scale. Eugen Jochum. Now, Jochum was known as the little Furtwängler, somewhat contemptuously, because he was one of those interventionist German conductors who played the music with great freedom, flexibility of pulse. I think he was great in Beethoven. I love his performances. There are wonderful things. He did 3 Beethoven cycles. Let us not forget one with the Bavarian radio for Deutsche Grammophon, which was partly mono. One with the Concertgebouw, which I think is his most lyrical and also in some ways the most soft-edged, but very, very beautiful. And then this last one with the London Symphony, London Phil, right? Yes, I think this is the London Phil. Let's make clear who's doing what. I hate these boxes because, they just list everything, but they don't say who does what. But it was with the London something. I'm going to look at the box and tell you exactly what it was. Here they are, Beethoven Symphonies, Ludwig van Beethoven. There's Ludwig. Okay. Maybe they will now tell us who's playing what. Well, it was done in Kingsway Hall, and so... I don't know. It's got to say here. Hang on a second. The Bruckners are with, this is the big box. It's got the Bruckners with the Staatskapelle Dresden. And, London Symphony Chorus. It's the London Symphony Orchestra. And I think that these are his best Beethovens on balance because they bring to bear all of the things he learned in all of the previous cycles. And I find his music making so warm and humane and there's just a, Beethoven's supposed to be about like struggle and harshness and all that. And there is in Jochum a certain, comfortableness that some people might object to. He may sound a bit too relaxed. I just think it's an aspect of his humanity. He always makes the music sing. It breathes. It communicates. It's gorgeous. It's just gorgeous. And this last cycle he did for EMI, I think, is really one of the special Beethoven cycles. It never gets the attention it deserves. His Concertgebouw has sort of more mystique, that cycle. And it's being re-released now in a Jochum, all of his, orchestral music that he did for Philips box that's on Decca now. That's coming. So we'll have to talk about that at some point as well. But I think this EMI box, it's got his Staatskapelle Dresden Bruckners. It's got his London Phil. Yeah, it's the London Phil Brahms cycle, which is fabulous. I mean, fabulous. One of the all-time great ones. And it has one of my all-time favorite Bach B minor masses back with Bavarian radio. I mean, you got to have this set anyway. And it's extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. It is totally consistent. It is a unified conception of Beethoven and how the music should be played, and it contains no subpar performances anywhere. Similarly, Herbert Blomstedt. Now again, we have 2 Beethoven cycles to contend with. The first with the Staatskapelle Dresden, and that may contain a few performances that are more interesting than these newcomers with the Gewandhaus. I think, for example, the 8th is better in that set, maybe the 7th. But as everyone knows, that Staatskapelle Dresden set, wonderful though it is, was a bit undercharacterized in the 5th and the 9th. And here he's gotten his act together, and the approach is quite different. Here now he said he's doing something with attempting to get closer to Beethoven's metronome markings. It's, a nod to the historically informed performance people. I wouldn't worry. He doesn't do it so much, especially in the ninth. And that's the great thing about it, because his own musicality, thank God, takes precedence over Beethoven's metronome markings at every point. He has the Gewandhaus playing in top form. The sonics are beautiful. The performances are all of a piece. They are the product of a great conductor who has had time to live with and think about the music, and whose conception of it is fully formed and fully represented in every single performance in this box. So I feel, as a Beethoven collector and a critic and a guy who just loves this stuff, I have to have both. I've got to have the Staatskapelle Dresden box and this new box. But for consistency, and that's what we're talking about here, consistency and completeness of vision, and that represents where Blomstedt is in his life now with Beethoven. Here it is with the Leipzig Gewandhaus, a great Beethoven cycle. Now we only have 3 to go, and these, I think, I like these. As we were talking about the Beethoven sonatas, we were talking about sort of the opposite poles in approaching the symphonies, sort of the more classicizing and the more romantics, that sort of thing. So I'm going to cite that particular dichotomy again in speaking of these last 3 sets, because I think that they represent them. First, Barenboim, one of the great modern Beethoven sets. This is with the Staatskapelle Berlin. Here, Barenboim went all in again for the similar to Jochum in a way, for the German romantic approach to Beethoven. That doesn't mean heaviness. It means trenchant rhythms, sculpted bass lines, excitement in the quick movements, and plenty of flow and lyricism, and that searching for sublimity and spiritual whatever in the slow movements. It's wonderful. This is a gorgeous set, fabulously recorded. He had the Staatskapelle Berlin at the top of its game. This was one of those cycles where everyone involved knew that it mattered, that they didn't just, we're going to do a Beethoven cycle, it must be Tuesday. No. This is a very serious undertaking by people who appreciated the magnitude of what they were doing and made sure that they got it right. There may be performances in here you like better than others or don't like them at all, but there are no bad ones, and none of it is inconsistent. So Barenboim with the Staatskapelle Berlin is one of the great modern Beethoven cycles. There's no question about it in my mind. Next, the opposite end of the spectrum, Szell. Big surprise, right? And Cleveland. Another, consistency and at the highest possible standard is what Szell stood for, right? These guys couldn't give a bad performance if their lives depended on it. This is a astonishingly great cycle. It has the reference recording of the Eroica, a totally cosmically great 5th, a reference recording of the 7th, a fabulous 9th. There is nothing in here not to love. I think his pastoral is stunning. It was a piece he did just about better than anybody, and nobody seems to want to acknowledge it. It was extraordinary. There is nothing but one delight after another in listening to these performances. Again, you might want like timpani with harder sticks. That's the way they would be played now. In like the 4th Symphony, you might find that that's a little mushy, but these are performances of cosmic greatness, start to finish. And whether you like Szell or not, whether you find him too controlled, you have to acknowledge what he achieved here. This is absolutely great Beethoven by any standard you care to name, and you really have to have this set. It's one of the ones you have to have. It's cheap now. It's in a budget box. If you don't have the Szell Mega Box, which I'm sure a lot of you do have, but it's inexpensive, and you can't do better. It's fabulous. We live in such great times. But, however, you got to pick one, don't you? And so I am picking one which combines excellence of performance, seriousness of intention, complete, absolute magnificence of execution, and fabulous modern digital recording that is still, I think, a standard that other labels should aspire to in this music. Günter Wand with the NDR Symphony. I mean, it's like Szell's in the sense that it's a more classicizing Beethoven. It is, however, not without its, which you might call German flexible elements, or its more romantic character, especially in the later symphonies, especially in the ninth. And, where Wand is more likely to intervene in a good way, where Szell is a little bit more straightforward. You can't choose between them, but this is the modern Beethoven cycle to own if you're having only one. There are things in these performances, just simple, musical, sensible things that will have you running to the scores, looking to see why he did that. And you see that's exactly what Beethoven wrote. I mean, check out just like the timpani part in the first movement of the eighth, or his handling of the transitions in the scherzo and finale of the fifth, or his incredible rhythmic discipline in the first movement of the seventh. I mean, they're just time after time after time, you hear him doing things that you may not have heard before, but which once you've heard them, they sound so right. You just wonder where they've been. So here's my choice for the one Beethoven cycle that you absolutely must have. And I have to say, to Günter Wand's credit, he recorded individual symphonies more than once, but he only did one Beethoven cycle. Only one. He knew it mattered. The orchestra knew it mattered. They behave like it matters. And that's what you want in this music. You want it to matter. You want the players to show their purpose and intention with every single note, because the music is too great to be treated any less carefully and with that kind of it needs to have, it's Beethoven, right? It's got to be impetuous, it's got to be eruptive, it's got to have all those qualities, but they have to be achieved through simple dedication and hard work, right? Because today's musicians are the greatest that the history of music has ever known. They are technically at a level that is so high, and so they need to be reminded that all of that technical facility has a purpose. That purpose is to communicate the expressive intensity of Beethoven's vision, and it's the conductor's job to make sure that they do it, no matter how long or how much work it takes. All of these conductors do that. And so those are my choices in Beethoven Symphony cycles. We'll be talking about individual performances of individual works, and this is the Beethoven year, so God knows what's coming. But I hope that this gives you a good overview of complete cycles, complete boxes of all the symphonies where all of the performances are consistently fine. Thank you for listening to this chat. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I know this has been a long one. I apologize for that, but I wanted to give the topic the time and attention that it deserves, just like these performances give Beethoven symphonies the time and attention they deserve. Keep on listening, and thank you so much for joining me.